Summary of Down and Out in Paris and London by George Orwell. At the start of Down and Out in Paris and London, the narrator, George Orwell, a British man in his early 20s, is living in Paris's Latin Quarter in a hotel run by Madame F that is full of bugs and filled by a lot of strange people. Orwell is down to his last 450 francs. He makes a living by giving English classes and writing articles that are sometimes published. When a thief breaks into the hotel and steals from a number of rooms, his financial situation gets even worse. Orwell isn't left without any money, but he's close, and this is his first taste of real poverty. Orwell finds out that living on 6 francs a day is hard and full of failures and humiliations every day. Everywhere the poor man goes, bad things happen. If he spent his last dollar on milk, for example, there's a good chance a bug will ruin it before he can drink it. He lives on bread and margarine, but healthy food in store windows tempts him, and he's always just one bad thing away from real trouble. Orwell, who was born into aristocracy, calls this life the suburbs of poverty. It's important to note that Orwell's life as a poor man is, in many ways, less desperate than the lives of the men he hangs out with. Even though it's never said outright in the book, Orwell stays with the poor in Paris and London so that he can tell their story in a real and authoritative way. Many of the people he talks about can't help but be poor. But not with Orwell. During the 6 franc days, Orwell thinks of his Russian friend Boris, who told him to come see him whenever he needed help. But, sadly, it turns out that Boris is even worse off than Orwell. Boris spends his days in a dirty attic flat and dreams of better times because of his time as a soldier. Even though Boris is broke, he is always upbeat, and he tells Orwell that they'll soon have work, which will bring them more money and women than they can handle. Instead, Orwell and Boris spend days hanging out in doorways and alleys, hoping that one of the many restaurant owners in Paris will hire them. But they keep getting passed over, mostly because Boris walks with a limp and both guys look sad. Boris has to leave his flat, which is hard for him because he wants to sneak out without paying the rent so the owner won't see him. Boris and Orwell barely get away with their lives, and after a run of bad luck, they end up selling their overcoats for a good amount of money that will feed them for days. This money isn't enough to keep them going for long though, so Boris comes up with a new plan. Orwell will write about British politics for a Bolshevik newspaper in Paris. Orwell, who doesn't know much about politics, reluctantly agrees, only to find out that the whole thing is a trick. Boris and Orwell keep drifting, and after 3 days, they go to see a Russian friend of Boris's who wants to open a restaurant with a Norman theme. In the book, the Russian is called the patron. He is a fat, dishonest man who is very pleased by Orwell's English background. When the restaurant opens, which the patron says will be any day now, he agrees to hire both Orwell and Boris. On the other hand, the diner never opens. Orwell goes without food for 2 days and worries that he will never find work. When Boris shows up, he tells them that he has got them both jobs at the Hotel X, a fancy place near the Place de la Concorde. Orwell will be a plongeur, or cleaner, and Boris will be a waiter. Orwell is very happy, but his happiness doesn't last long. The work is hard and no one appreciates it. As a plongeur, he is at the bottom of the hotel's complicated rank system, which gives more respect to waiters and cooks than to those who work in the hot, smelly basement. The restaurant looks expensive from the outside, but when you look closely, you can see that it is dirty. The staff fights, bullies, and drinks their way through feeding 60 guests every night. There is violence, theft, and all kinds of bad behavior. Still, the work gets done, and after an 11-hour shift, Orwell and Boris fight their way onto the metro, eat a quick meal, and go to bed. Then they get up and start over. During this time, their only real pleasures are sleeping when they can and drinking in the hotel cafe on Saturday nights. Orwell works at the Hotel X for almost a month until Boris tells him that the patron's restaurant, the Auberge, is about to open. But the patron hasn't done any work on the restaurant since they were there last, so Orwell, Boris, another waiter, and a cook work around the clock to try to make it look nice and ready to serve guests. If the Hotel X was a bad place to work, the auberge is almost too much to stand. The kitchen is dirty and doesn't have enough tools. Rats are everywhere, and the staff can only keep the place open by being smart and working 17-hour days. Orwell is surprised that the auberge is a success, but he can't keep to the plan. Orwell says that there is no reason for a plongeur to live a sad life. Why should a man spend all of his waking hours doing hard work that keeps the rich in silly luxuries? Orwell eventually writes to B, a friend who lives in London, and asks if he knows of any jobs there. B tells Orwell right away that he knows a congenital imbecile who needs help. Orwell tells the auberge that he is leaving, and he sails to England. When Orwell got back to his home country, he found out that the family he was meant to work for was out of the country and wouldn't be able to hire him for a month. Since he spent most of his money on his journey and doesn't have a job yet, Orwell is forced to sell his clothes to make money until he gets a job. When he sells his clothes to a trader, he only gets a small amount of money and some rags in return. Now, Orwell knows a new kind of poverty, that of a homeless person trying to get by on the streets of London. Orwell spends the next month sleeping in a number of dirty and uncomfortable hotels, casual wards, and charitable places run by religious groups like the Salvation Army. During this time, Orwell meets Paddy Jacques, who becomes his friend. Paddy is an Irishman who is kind but chooses to be stupid. He lives on bread, margarine, and self-pity. Like many of the men Orwell talks about, Paddy fell into poverty because of bad luck. Now, he can't get out because the system is set up to help the rich. The same goes for Paddy's friend Bozo, who paints on the sidewalk. Bozo, on the other hand, can't feel sorry for himself like Paddy can. He paints, looks at the stars, and goes around the city on his bad leg. He laughs at bad luck and turns down help from religious groups because he is a firm atheist. Orwell thinks that Bozo is a great person. Bozo is the only person Orwell meets on the streets whose attitude hasn't been changed at least a little bit by being poor. Just like he thought the life of a plongeur was overly hard, Orwell thinks the life of a tramp is mostly avoidable. If the people who ran the spikes, also called casual wards, and London boarding houses put money into more comfortable beds, healthy food, and clean sheets, homeless people like Paddy Jacques might soon be able to get out of poverty, fueled by good food and hope for a better future. But instead, the people who own the boarding houses get rich by making other people suffer, and the system keeps going. A month goes by, Orwell gets a job, and his time as a poor person comes to an end. Orwell says that during the time he spent in hotels, restaurants, and lodging houses in Paris and London, he learned many important things. For example, he learned that beggars and tramps are not criminals and that he has no reason to expect gratitude when he gives a poor person a penny. Also, he says he will never go back to a smart restaurant. Orwell knows that what he has learned might not be enough to change the world right away for the better, but he sees it as a start. Orwell was born into wealth, but living with people for whom being poor is often a death sentence has changed the way he thinks.
About the author. Eric Blair was born in India to a wealthy English family when the British Empire was at its strongest. His father worked for the government of the Indians. His mother was born in Burma and grew up there. She moved to England with Blair and his sisters a year after he was born. Blair's family was well known but not rich, and Eric was only able to go to an elite boys' school when he was a teen because of what a family friend did. He started writing when he was young and got a scholarship to Eton, England's most famous public school, but dropped out when he was 18. Because Blair did poorly in school, his parents wanted him to join the Imperial Police. He did so in 1924 and went to the Irrawaddy Delta. His time as a police officer in Burma gave him ideas for his 1934 book, Burmese Days, and his 1936 essay, Shooting an Elephant, which are both harsh criticisms of British colonial policy in the area. He left his job in Burma in 1927 because he got dengue fever. While he was on vacation with his family in England, he made the decision to spend the rest of his life writing. Then, he spent the next few years living with the poor in London and Paris. His time with the poor in those cities solidified his support for democratic socialist ideas and led to a number of stories and essays that show how the rich treat the poor badly and make them feel bad about themselves. Victor Gollancz released Blair's book Down and Out in Paris and London under the name George Orwell in 1933. This was done so that Blair's family wouldn't be embarrassed by reading about his life as a tramp. After that, Blair wrote more exposes, such as The Road to Wigan Pier, which was about the miserable lives of factory workers in northern England, and Homage to Catalonia, which was about his time as a temporary soldier in the Spanish Civil War. In 1936, he got married to the artist Eileen O'Shaughnessy, who shared his political beliefs. Orwell couldn't have children, so he and his wife later adopted a boy named Robert Horatio Orwell. Orwell was making a name for himself as a public intellectual and muckraker. In 1939, he was declared unfit for military service because of breathing problems. He spent the war writing for many journals and magazines and writing Animal Farm in 1984, two of his most important works of fiction. The book struck a chord with people after the war and made Orwell a well-known name. He was 46 when he died in a London hospital from tuberculosis.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.